Thank you very much, Gary, for that introduction and for your short but comprehensive review of Copenhagen. I'm not sure that I quite like this half-full, half-empty glass analogy, because if you stood in a packed room with half a glass, you're already thinking about where you're going to get the top up. But if you're there with half a glass full, you're probably a little bit complacent about where the bar is. So I'm not entirely happy with that analogy. Now, in common with my leader, Gordon Brown, I think it's now beholden on me to say that for part of this morning at least, I will agree with Laura Lee, because we now agree with the Lib Dems on everything. Not quite. But I'll disagree with John. But actually, the truth is that between all three of us, I suspect you'll find quite a lot of consensus. I want to divide my contribution into two halves, Copenhagen and the general election, of course. It would be silly not to cover the election only 2 weeks out. My view of the Copenhagen summit is that it represents a plateau in climate change politics, and it's a plateau which is nowhere near high enough. And it begs the question, is this it? Have we gone as far as we can go? And my response would be yes, for the foreseeable future. This does represent the highest summit we're going to achieve for quite some considerable time. And as Gary has pointed out, the Accord represents an agreement that 2 degrees is a catastrophic level beyond which we should not go. Most analysts of the Accord and the offers that have been made by now, I think, over 100 countries that have acknowledged the Accord, represent a likelihood that climate change, the temperature increase would be around 4 degrees higher than current levels. That means that we would be moving into uncharted territory altogether. If 2 degrees represents the tipping point between possibly a safe environment and an unsafe environment, 4 degrees is disastrous. It could represent that stage in the evolution of climate change where we have unstoppable feedback effects. And I think actually we may have 1 or 2 unstoppable feedback effects already. And these effects will force the environment to warm even more. And let's look at the people who are signing the Accord. China has not set a target of net carbon emissions. China is merely moving to a position which George Bush had, which is to say we would try and reduce our carbon intensity per unit of GDP. So obviously if GDP races ahead, as China's is yet again, but their intensity of carbon per unit decreases, well, you still end up with a massive increase in carbon emissions. India has sent a letter to the Secretariat of the UNFCCC saying, yes, we acknowledge the Accord. But if you read the debate in the Indian Parliament where this was announced, you will discover that they're merely noting it in order not to be frozen out of any future discussions. The United States is currently talking about its legislation. The legislation on the cards at the moment, which came out of Congress, suggests a decrease in CO2 emissions on a 1990 baseline of merely 4%. Well, in 1997, the United States, even outside of Kyoto, were talking about a 5% reduction. That is going in the wrong direction. So whilst these commitments might be being made, at the moment I don't think they represent very much. We'll have a new bill in the Senate, which will be published on Monday, the Kerry, Graham and Lieberman bill. We'll see how far that gets. But it looks like it'll have a tougher fight than the bill that went into Congress. That means we've already heard discussions coming from Obama himself, suggesting that we will have the greater exploration of oil fields and gas fields, including off Alaska and Florida, as compromises to try and get Republicans and questioning Democrats on board. And only this week we've seen the Obama administration saying that it may well resort to protectionist measures to stop perhaps imports from China coming in when the cost met by US manufacturers is higher. So we're moving into very dangerous territory in how many compromises might have to be made to get that bill through. I acknowledge that Copenhagen has now put on the table $30 billion in fast start money to tackle climate change, with a longer term aim of $100 billion or it's about £67 billion by 2020. So it's not all bad news, but I have to say, if that is the plateau that we're at, we need to start scratching our heads and thinking again. But it's also not all bad news, because at least the political direction seems to be in one direction, which is towards tackling climate change, albeit by my lights on a too slower track. Even in Saudi Arabia, they are now talking about renewable energy. Abu Dhabi is developing this great new city on renewable principles. So even people who are sitting on the oil know that something has to change, even though they may be more motivated by peak oil than by climate change. And Saudi Arabia, along with Canada and one or two others, are the recidivist, objection-prone people in the climate change talk. So the COP wasn't entirely a failure, but it could be a very deceptive success. The biggest part which I think was absent is the absence of a legally binding agreement, and the likelihood of one is a long way off. Hard to see the United States signing up to an international treaty which demands anything more than they're prepared to offer, which is not enough. And without a legally binding agreement, it will have as much effect as perhaps Kyoto had, where if a country chooses not to do anything, there's no punishment, there's no comeback, there's no cost attached to it. And the other problem, which I'll come back to very briefly, I think, is the absence of what is a coherent international framework that has to bring everybody on board. If you do not have the coherent international framework, you will have carbon leakage. You will have countries that are excused any part of this New Deal. Even if at the moment they are not big emitters, what are the chances that they'll remain that way if they have a reward from people who have to move their industries to countries which have more liberal regimes in terms of carbon emissions? So I would say my conclusion on Copenhagen is that the whole thing has a built-in optimism bias, and we have to be on our guard against it all the time, where we'll talk about the high targets and only aim to deliver the low targets. And I would have to say that the UK government has said in its manifesto, the Labour Party I should say, has said in its manifesto that it aims to improve on what Copenhagen offered. Turning to the UK, we do have this general election, in case you haven't noticed. The election campaign has effectively been going on for the last 6 months, and climate change has not featured anywhere in that election at a high level. The leaders are focused on the recession. For obvious reasons, we have to obey our Hippocratic oath as politicians, which is to deliver to you a higher material standard of living than any of the other parties. That's what it's all about. It's the economy, stupid. So climate change is frozen out, and frankly, the electorates do not seem all that interested in any case, apart from in one or two local situations. I did say at the beginning, I don't think there's a huge difference between the parties on many areas, and I think it's partly because there was a consensus on the Climate Change Act, where all the parties agreed that it was a necessary step, and I'm very pleased that there was that consensus in Parliament. There will be differences and difficulties on delivering the Climate Change Act, but one of the key things that the Climate Change Act set up was this rolling programme of carbon budgets. And I hope you all know about the carbon budgets, but these will be advised upon by the Independent Climate Change Committee. And I think to the future, if you want to look in a parliament to where some of the radical policies will actually emerge, it will be from the Independent Climate Change Committee. They were pushing for the electrical vehicles and a massive expansion of those, many other things too, which even 3 years ago would have looked impossible. But coming from this committee, it almost looks conservative with a small c. One of the problems I have with all of our manifestos is that none of the parties have tried to relate their manifestos to this budgeting process. We've all heard how the Lib Dems and the Conservatives would have emergency budgets after the election within 60 days. Why is nobody coming up, including the Labour Party perhaps, except being in power you don't talk about emergency in quite the same way. But the opposition parties are not talking about emergency carbon budgets, and particularly for the Lib Dems, with whom I think we have the most radical agenda, frankly, there should be that kind of approach to put it on the agenda so that Nick Clegg can answer the questions on that subject, because they would go a bit further than the other parties, and that would have a big impact, I think, on people's behaviour. So I think that is one area that really does need addressing, and that might put it on the election agenda in the last 2 weeks that we have available, whether we do need some kind of emergency response to what all three party leaders have described as the greatest threat to humanity existing today. Now, I just mentioned that there is agreement, I think, between the parties. All parties, unlike in the States, agree that climate change is a problem and we need to work hard at it. I'm surely coming to the end of my time, Gary, but I just wanted to look at two or three minutes. I think, as I said, the Lib Dems do want to go a bit further, and maybe that's a good thing if they're going to be part of a Lib Lab Pact. I actually think a Lib Lab Pact might be quite a good response to the development of climate change policy after the election. With a certain degree of radicalism and a certain degree of mainstream reality, we could possibly have a combination of forces which would deliver more than we're currently committed to. The Lib Dems want to see a 40% cut in emissions by 2020. Well, Labour is committed in the UK domestic scene to a 34% cut by that point, and we say in our manifesto that we want Europe to go beyond its current commitments, which for the UK would mean something like a 40% cut. We would like the European Union to go from its 20% to its 30% cut by 2030. So there is agreement there, I think, between the Lib Dems and ourselves. We say we would like to see electricity, 40% of it by 2020 coming from renewables. So do the Lib Dems. I don't know if the Conservatives would put a figure on it. They don't in their manifesto. So there are a number of areas of agreement there. Also on insulation programmes, rolling out programmes of micro-renewables. The Lib Dems talk about £10,000, which will be paid for over the lifetime energy savings per household. The Conservatives talk about 6,500. We don't put a figure on that, but we talk about the same kind of programme to be paid for over the lifetime of those savings. So there are many areas where there is agreement. Where there is disagreement, where I agree with the Lib Dems and not with my own party, is that nuclear power is going to be a mammoth mistake. If you want renewables and you want nuclear power, well, you don't have enough money for both, is my view. I think that is well proven, not least by people like the Chief Executive of EDF, who has been pleading the point. They wanted to be green when they were arguing the case for nuclear. Now they've got the nuclear commitment. They want to drop renewables because they can't afford it. The Conservatives want nuclear. Final point, the global framework, which we do have to have, which inevitably, arithmetically would arrive anyway, is that at some point, maybe by 2050, everybody in the world has equal per capita emissions. Does it arrive by accident, or do we actually plan for it in a fully inclusive agreement? This is where I agree with, well, John, I think, disagrees slightly with me on this. Contraction and convergence is the name of that agreement. The Lib Dems are signed up to it. If they get into government with Labour, I hope that they will push that, because Labour at the moment, whilst agreeing with it in practice, never wants to call it by its true name. So I'll leave it at that point. Thank you.